Good afternoon. Today I'm going to be reviewing the Pagani Design PD-1792 GMT. This watch is available from Pagani Design official store on AliExpress for €128. So firstly, let's look at the box that the watch comes in, and then I'll talk you through the specifications of the piece. So the watch comes in this cardboard watch box, and inside it sits on a piece of foam inside a foam cutout panel. Now this is a disappointment at €128. I would like to see Pagani Design upgrade the cardboard watch boxes they're using to either plastic Pelican style cases or alternatively plastic travel cases, because this is a clear cost cutting measure, and at €128 it is wholly unacceptable. With regards to the items you get with the watch, this is the branded microfiber polishing cloth. I always think it's a nice touch to get a branded microfiber polishing cloth irrespective of the price point of a piece. This is the owner's instruction manual, clear concise diagrams. The instructions are in English and it details the operation of the movement used, which is the Pearl DG5833 GMT automatic. This is the plastic guarantee card, and on the reverse you can see it's blank, and again this is a disappointment. Pagani Design should be filling in the date of purchase, reference number and the dealer's stamp or signature. But the watch is covered by a 12-month international guarantee. And lastly, one also gets this plastic tag which has the Pagani Design Shield emblem embossed, and it says top waterproof because the piece is water resistant to 100 meters. So with regards to the specifications of the piece, we have a 41mm case diameter. We have a lug-to-lug measurement of 47.2mm, a thickness of 13mm and a lug width of 20mm. The bracelet tapers from 20mm at the lugs down to 18mm at the 2-button push butterfly clasp. So this is another cost-cutting measure. As you can see, it's a sterile butterfly clasp. I would like to see Pagani Design engrave the clasp with the Pagani Design Shield or alternatively Pagani Design text logo, because a sterile clasp at this price point of €128 is unacceptable. Light resistance to the 2-button push triggers to the deployant, and both halves of the butterfly clasp open with no resistance. Mirror polished solid 316L grade stainless steel butterfly clasp. So the mirror polishing is done to a good standard on the top side, underside and flanks, and the 2 spring-loaded triggers, and it snaps shut with a positive click to the left-hand portion and the right-hand portion. We have a double dome sapphire crystal with no AR coating. Now when I tilt the piece at an oblique angle, you can see, due to the highly reflective nature of the silver mirror polished handset and the silver mirror polished applied indices, as well as the applied Pagani Design Shield at 12 o'clock, it's a highly reflective piece. And this is also compounded by the textured dial having a glossy rather matte finish to it, so it's very shiny. Now, this does not have AR coating, and it is wholly unacceptable at €128 to have a sapphire crystal without AR coating, because the cost of Pagani Design, in terms of production cost, the cost of adding AR coating to the underside of sapphire crystals is negligible, because they're using massive batch production volumes. And it's a clear cost-cutting measure in order to maximise their profit margin per piece. And as you can see, the negative is that it is a very reflective piece. When I tilt it at an oblique angle, there's a lot of glare, and therefore the legibility and the clarity is poor. So the bezel is solid 316L grade stainless steel, brushed satin finish, and we have a contrasting mirror polished bevel to it, no sharp edges to it, and the mirror polished chamfer is finished to a good standard, and it complements the bevel running along the flanks of the case. So quality of finishing is good on the bezel, and I like the way the double dome sapphire crystal has a bevel which projects above the top edge of the bezel because it catches the light. It's very aesthetically pleasing. The engraving to the bezel is high definition. The Arabic numerals are correctly proportioned, as are the hour ticks. So it's aesthetically pleasing but also legible and functional, and they've done a good job of engraving the hour marks in the 24 hours in Arabic numerals. Now the dial is too thick. If you look at the date complication at 3 o'clock, you can see it is a textured dial, and of course it's moulded to have a textured finish which has a glossy finish to it. The problem with such a thick dial is the date wheel has a shadow around it. If you look at the framing of the date's complication, you can see it's very deep. The date wheel is sunk very deep beneath the dial due to the thickness of the textured dial. And that means it's hard to read the white date wheel with black Arabic numerals. They've also framed it with white, and really this doesn't help the legibility. They should have enlarged the size of the rectangular date window, and that would have reduced the shadow, and it would have made the date wheel more legible, because this dark shadow around it means that it's hard to read the date in the absence of a Cyclops magnifier, which would help. So it's a poorly executed dial. They've simply made the dial too thick and the date complication too small, the date window too small to read due to the shadow, and therefore it would actually be better if they deleted the date window and just had an index at the 3 o'clock position rather than a useless date complication. With regards to the printing, the white minute ticks on the chapter ring are clearly legible, and the printing of the white paint is high definition, as is Pagani design underneath the silver applied shield. I think it would look more aesthetically pleasing if they simply used the silver applied Pagani design shield and deleted the Pagani design text in white, because that would clean up the dial. The other thing is, they've made a mistake with the text. If you look at the GMT automatic at 6 o'clock, it's too large. They've simply used Arial font, and they could have done a better job and used a more interesting font such as Garamond. The Arial font is too large because GMT automatic is actually larger than the font and text used for Pagani Design's logo at 12 o'clock. Text at the 6 o'clock position should always be smaller than the text used in the brand's logo at 12, and so it's very poorly designed, and using Arial font in capitals really is disappointing. It doesn't look aesthetically pleasing. It looks very basic and plain, and the text is far too large. With regards to the crown, it's knurled finish, solid 316L grade stainless steel, and signed with the Pagani design shield with mirror polished effect on a matte speed blasted background. Mirror polished chamfer to the knurled crown, so no sharp edges to it, but it does look and feel under proportioned. And the problem is they've recessed the crown into the right hand flank of the case too far, because the crown guards are quite large, and therefore the crown doesn't project enough from the right hand flank of the case. It's actually hard to get a grip of it, because you can see there is a bezel overhang over the top of the crown, and also the crown guards also project either side of the crown, so it doesn't leave much projection. The crown doesn't actually stick proud enough from the right hand flank to get a good grip of it with one's index finger and thumb, so it's actually hard to get a grip of the knurled crown because it's too low profile. And also the crown guards are too large, and the bezel overhangs the top of it where you'd get a grip of it with your thumb. So let's test the screw down crown execution. The screw down crown provides an effective hermetic seal to 100 meters, which is acceptable for a daily wear piece with a GMT complication. So difficult to get a grip of it with one's index finger and thumb due to the crown guards and also the overhang of the bezel. It's under proportioned. A coin edge finish to this would be more grippy and tactile. The knurled finish is too smooth and it's hard to get a grip of. Now the crown feels rough. It's not silky smooth, it feels rough. There's a lot of resistance in the internal thread interfacing with the external thread of the stainless steel crown tube, so one can feel the friction of metal to metal contact. You can feel the 316L grade stainless steel crown rubbing against the thread on the 316L grade stainless steel crown tube. So there is room for improvement. Now it does unscrew with a minimal number of turns, which is good. And when it's unscrewed, we're now in the manual wind position, so one can manually wind the Pearl DG5833 GMT automatic to its maximum 40-hour power reserve. It feels gritty when you're unscrewing it, and it also feels gritty when you're manually winding it. It doesn't feel smooth. For example, to compare this to the Seiko NH34A, which is another GMT automatic, that feels a lot smoother to manually wind. The Pearl DG5833 has a lot of resistance, and you can feel the gearing and also the friction in the movement and the tension in the mainspring building up, but it just doesn't feel smooth. It's not a pleasant movement to manually wind, it feels rough. Now, pulling it out to the first click position is the quick set date complication, so if you look closely at the 3 o'clock date window, rotating it clockwise has a nice positive click. So it does have positive indexing. It feels similar to a Seiko NH35A. That's the kind of feeling of the quick set complication. Each day of the month clicks over with a nice positive click, and I like that solid feeling of it. It also feels very similar to the NH34A, which you might be familiar with. Now, the movement has a GMT hour hand, which is driven off the date complication. So when you're in the date setting position, if you rotate the crown clockwise, that advances the date. If you rotate the crown anti-clockwise, that rotates the GMT hour hand, as you can see. So the GMT hour hand is directly driven off the date complication. So you can rotate the crown clockwise to advance the date and rotate the crown anti-clockwise to advance the GMT hour hand. But the negative is you can only rotate the GMT hour hand clockwise. You can't rotate it anti-clockwise. So that's the disadvantage of the GMT hour hand being driven off the date complication. You can only rotate the date clockwise to the next day of the month, and rotating the crown anti-clockwise will only rotate the GMT hour hand clockwise. So if you're setting the GMT hour, you have to cycle through the 12 hours, which is a disadvantage. You can't move the GMT hour hand clockwise and anti-clockwise. Pulling it out to the second click position hacks the movement. If you look at the second hand, you can see it's possible to stop the second hand dead and set the time precisely to the second. So we're now in the time setting position, and you can see there is significant back play. When I rotate the crown clockwise and anti-clockwise, it's very sloppy. You can see there is a lot of back play. I rotate the crown and the minute hand doesn't move. You can see I'm now rotating the crown clockwise and anti-clockwise. The minute hand is doing nothing. I have to really rotate the crown clockwise and anti-clockwise to pick up the back play in the gearing in order to get the minute hand to respond. So that's a negative of the Pearl DG5833 GMT. There is a lot of play in the movement. I'm rotating the crown clockwise and anti-clockwise now. The minute hand isn't moving. So lots of play in the movement, lots of resistance in it. There feels like a lot of friction, and it just feels like the tolerances and the gearing are poorly machined and the quality control is poor because it feels very tight, and that indicates excessive friction. There's not good meshing between the gear teeth, and there is a lot of friction in the jewels. So poor quality. It feels unpleasant to manually wind. There's a lot of back play when setting the time, and when you rotate the crown, you have to take up that slack, so it's not a pleasant movement. Pushing it back in, it's got a nice positive click, and that restarts the movement. You can see the second hand begins to sweep around the dial once again. So let's test screwing the crown back down. Now this is disappointing because we do not have immediate thread pickup. There's a poor interface between the internal thread of the stainless steel crown and the external thread of the stainless steel crown tube. It's difficult to get the threads to pick up, and one really has to force in the winding stem into the movement. It's heavily sprung loaded, far more sprung loaded than an NH34A, for example. And one can do it, but it takes a couple of times. Like I'm trying now 2 or 3 times to get the threads. I'm rotating the crown clockwise and anti-clockwise to try and get the threads to pick up. Finally, I've got it to pick up on the 3rd attempt. But it should happen first time, every single time. And the disappointing thing about this is Pagani design are capable of producing silky smooth crowns. For example, I've reviewed a plethora of PD-1661s and PD-1662s, and every single one of those had a silky smooth screw down crown. Both unscrewing it and screwing it felt smooth. There was minimal friction in the threading and minimal friction from the rubber O-ring gaskets inside. There are 2 rubber O-ring gaskets, one inside the crown, one inside the crown tube. But this one is very rough, it feels gritty, it feels stiff, there's a lot of friction in the threads, and there's also a lot of friction from the rubber O-ring gaskets. There's 2 rubber O-rings inside this, one inside the crown, one inside the crown tube, providing an effective hermetic seal to 100 meters. So poorly executed crown, very disappointing. Right, so I'll show you the Caseback. So we've got an exhibition Caseback, which is 316L grade stainless steel glazed with mineral crystal. Now, the mineral crystal is another cost-cutting measure. It should be glazed with sapphire crystal as per the crystal in the front of the piece. Mineral crystal is acceptable with low-tier pieces costing below €100. This is 128, so therefore one expects better quality specification. It should be sapphire crystal. But on a positive note, the quality of the exhibition Caseback in terms of finishing and build quality is good. Concentric CNC lathe tool machining to the inner portion, and the circumference is mirror polished. Milled slots are deburred to a good standard, so no sharp edges, no burrs, and the flat mineral crystal in the centre of the exhibition Caseback is very smooth and comfortable against the wrist and very low profile. So the profile is good. The quality of the finishing is good. It's just disappointing they're using mineral crystal rather than sapphire. So the exhibition Caseback does a good job of displaying the movement used, which is the Pearl DG5833 GMT automatic, and Pagani Design have decorated it with a blued screw in the cannon pinion, and also they've decorated the rotor. As you can see, it's signed with the shield. So although it isn't a very aesthetically pleasing movement to look at, they have made the best of it by decorating the rotor and adding a blued screw to it. These solid end links are a good tight fit to the head of the piece, and they're well finished. Conventional stainless steel spring bars rather than quick release spring bars. The female pivoted end links are well machined, no sharp edges, no burrs, and the underside to the head of the piece is well finished. We don't have any sharp edges to the edges of the flanks, and the tips of the lugs are deburred and chamfered to a good standard. Right, so I'll give you a wrist shot and you can see how it fits on my 8-inch wrist. Now, I haven't sized the bracelet, and I'm pleased to report there's plenty of links in the bracelet. This will easily fit up to a 9-inch wrist. So if you're a collector with a larger wrist, you have no worries whatsoever because there are plenty of links for a larger wrist. The butterfly clasp is low profile and it does feel comfortable against the wrist, which is good. It doesn't stick out too proud, but it's just disappointing it's sterile and unsigned. It would look better with the Pagani Design shield engraved. Now, I think they've made a mistake with this piece. It's a 41mm head of the piece, so it does have wrist presence, but they've used a 20 to 18 taper, which just isn't enough. The problem is this feels like a very heavy piece at 154 grams. Now, bear in mind, it does have a lot of links in the bracelet, so of course, you're going to be reducing the heft to below 150 if you remove links from the bracelet. But even so, a 20 to 16 taper would look far more aesthetically pleasing, and it would better balance the piece because it feels like a very large top heavy piece. The head feels very large, the bracelet feels too heavy for it with a 20 to 18 taper. The 18mm taper at the butterfly clasp isn't enough. There's too much meat in the bracelet links. It needs to be 20 to 16. That is the correct taper. It's the industry standard. 22 to 18 is acceptable on larger pieces over 41mm, but the other industry standard is 20 to 16. 20 to 18 really doesn't work because the bracelet looks too straight and parallel rather than being tapered. They've made the correct decision by using female pivoted end links rather than male end links because that does pull the end link in the bracelet snug to the wrist, so there's a minimal gap and there's a nice curved undercut to the head of the piece. So it wraps around the wrist very well, and it is 13mm, which is good despite having a double domed crystal, as you can see, which does add 2mm of thickness. So it will easily slip underneath a shirt cuff. I often refer to 13mm as being the sweet spot for pieces because it easily slides underneath the cuff of a shirt, and it does feel well proportioned despite having the incorrect proportions of the bracelet. It's a heavy piece, 154 grams, and I think that they could reduce that by using a 20 to 16 taper. I think this would look better with a flat sapphire crystal because the problem with the double dome sapphire crystal is it adds thickness, but also the clarity is very poor, as you can see, because the dial is sunk very deep away from the underside of the sapphire crystal, and you can see just how much reflection there is. If this had a flat sapphire crystal with AR coating, the legibility and the clarity would be improved, because at the moment, when I tilt it at an oblique angle, we get some distortion at the edge of the crystal. Due to the thickness, it's double domed rather than single domed, so the distortion isn't due to it having a flat underside causing a magnification effect. The distortion is simply caused by the crystal being too thick. As you can see, when I tilt it at an oblique angle there, it's 2mm thick of crystal, and therefore we get that distortion effect. So the legibility is poor. No AR coating, too shiny and reflective, too much glare, and then we have the distortion because the crystal is simply too thick. If it was a flat sapphire crystal, it could be 1 millimeter or 1.5 millimeters rather than 2 millimeters of double dome sapphire crystal. So incorrect choice for a GMT piece. It would look better with a flat sapphire crystal and AR coating. The textured dial really doesn't add any interest to it. Again, it would look better with a matte dial, or alternatively a glossy black enamel dial. The textured finish just compounds the legibility problems because it makes the date complication have a shadow on it permanently. But the mirror polishing to the bevel on the case matches the chamfer on the bezel, and the brush satin finishing is done to a good standard. So the quality of the finishing to the head of the piece is good. So let's look at the bracelet. Now, this is disappointing. If you look at the female pivoted end links, we've got significant play. Lateral side-to-side play, longitudinal play, up and down play in every single direction. The problem with the play around the spring bar is that it rattles, and it's significant. So when on wrist, it makes an annoying clicking sound, it rattles. And this is very poor quality. Now, I'll just check the other side for comparison. Again, we have the same problem. This is simply due to the hole being drilled in the centre links in the bracelet too large. And as you can see, it's a sloppy fit around the spring bar. They simply need to improve the tolerances to drill a smaller hole so that the spring bar is an interference fit in the hole rather than being a sloppy fit. Just look at the amount of play in every single direction. Lateral side to side, up and down, and longitudinal. Every single direction around the spring bar. And it does articulate freely because of all that play, but the problem is it rattles. Now that's not the only problem. If you look at the bracelet links, every single one of the links in this bracelet across the whole length has significant play in it. And the cumulative effect of all that play is the bracelet rattles, it feels very sloppy. And it's very bad. And this is the problem with using push pins in the bracelet, which has poor tolerances rather than screw pins. If Pagani design used screw pins, as per the PD-1791 and the PD-1792 oyster style bracelets, for example, that tightens up the play. And that would help the problem, because even if the links were poor tolerance, the screw pins would tighten them up. But by using push pins rather than screw pins, we've got very bad play. Every single one of these links has excessive play. Longitudinal, lateral, up and down play in every single direction. I'll just check the other side for comparison. Again, we have the same problem. The cumulative effect across the bracelet length is every single link has excessive play in the push pins, and it rattles. It's a very sloppy bracelet. This is not below €100. One could be magnanimous about this kind of poor quality control and build quality if it were below €100. This is €128. Wholly unacceptable. Right, so let's do a Lume test, and we'll see how the Lume performs when it's charged up to the absolute maximum. So as always, I'm going to use my 100 UV LED torch to charge it up to the absolute peak. Right, so that's now fully charged, and we are clearly looking at Luminova. This is not C3 Superluminova. There's a real difference between Luminova and Superluminova in terms of the exciter, which makes the Lume glow brightly. Now, the quality of the Lume in terms of colour tone match is correct. The C3 Luminova used on the applied indices and the hands is the same green tone, so that's a positive. But we're clearly looking at 3 to 4 layers of Luminova rather than 5 to 6 layers, and we're also looking at Luminova rather than Superluminova. This is a cost-cutting measure too far. Now, the problem with this having C3 Luminova and only 3 to 4 layers is the lume on the hands and the dial is now going to fade, and it's going to fade fast. The exciter doesn't hold the charge for any length of time, and immediately it's beginning to fade, and it will fade quickly. So this really is a production cost-cutting measure too far at this price point, €128. It should be either BGW9 or C3 Superluminova and 5 to 6 layers at this price point. That is the industry standard. And Pagani Design really need to upgrade this because it's very disappointing. The colour tone match is good, but the problem is there's just not enough thickness of it, and also Luminova is cheaper quality than Super Lume Nova. So disappointing performance. It's not glowing brightly and it's now beginning to fade, and as time goes on it will fade very rapidly. So I'd like to see that upgraded, and it is another disappointment. Right, so let's discuss the movement used in this piece. So Pagani Design call this movement the Pearl DG5833 GMT Automatic. I'll tell you what the movement really is. It's not a Pearl DG5833 GMT. It's actually a Mingzhu caliber DG3804. So the Mingzhu DG3804 is a clone of the ETA 2893 with a GMT hour hand added, and as I demonstrated, the GMT hour hand is driven off the date complication. So when you rotate the crown clockwise, it advances the quickset date, and when you rotate the crown anti-clockwise, it advances the GMT hour hand. So it's a clone of the ETA 2893 with a GMT hour hand added. So why do Pagani Design call it the Pearl DG5833 when it's actually a Mingzhu caliber DG3804? Well, I'll explain. Mingzhu movements have a poor reputation as being unreliable, and of course that's not a selling point for Pagani Design, Mingzhu movements being unreliable. So what they do is they rebrand it. They call it the Pearl DG5833 to disguise the reality, which is it's a Mingzhu DG3804, which is an unreliable movement. Now, usually movements that start with the reference number DG are made by Dixmont Guangzhou, and Dixmont Guangzhou have a good reputation for reliability, and of course it's respected. So when a collector sees that a movement has a reference number beginning with DG, they assume that it's made by Dixmont Guangzhou and it's going to be a reliable movement. And Pagani Design want to disguise the Mingzhu 3804 being unreliable, so they label it the DG3804, and that means that collectors might not know that it's a Mingzhu movement which is unreliable. And to further disguise it, they don't call it a Mingzhu DG3804, they call it the Pearl DG5833. So collectors think that this movement is made by a factory called Pearl rather than being made by Mingzhu. They think it might be reliable. So that's the reality of it. This movement is not made by Dixmont Guangzhou. It's not a DG caliber. It's actually made by Mingzhu, and it's unreliable. Now, it's the luck of the draw whether you get a good or bad one. If you get a good Pearl DG5833, they can last for years. But if you get a bad one, they can fail within a matter of weeks. And there's no way of telling whether you've got a good or bad one. It really is the luck of the draw. So the Pearl DG5833, which is really a Mingzhu DG3804, has 22 joules. It runs at 21,600 vibrations per hour and a frequency of 3 Hz. 40-hour power reserve, quick set date complication. The stated accuracy is -20 to +40 seconds per day. So a rather wide accuracy range, the same as the Seiko NH34A. Now, this one is running consistently at +15 seconds per day, which is fast, but +15 is well within the -20 to +40 seconds per day. And that is the kind of accuracy you can expect with a Pearl DG5833, +15 per day. The problem with the movements is they run most accurately when they're fully wound to their maximum 40-hour power reserve, but when the power reserve becomes depleted below 40 hours, for example, when it has 8 hours to 12 hours of power reserve, which is typical, the accuracy then becomes very bad. They can be ±15 seconds per day typically. So it's an inaccurate movement and an unreliable movement. So they can be regulated better than -20 to +40, but they typically run at ±15 seconds per day even after regulation. So unreliable and inaccurate, and I think it's a real disappointment that Pagani Design are still using the Pearl DG5833 GMT movements in their GMT watches rather than the Seiko NH34A, which is a far better movement. The NH34A is reliable, well proven, it's a good, robust movement. The accuracy is good, the build quality, quality control. And really, it's not an expensive movement, so it wouldn't increase the price point of this piece beyond €128 retail. At €128, the NH34A is the correct choice. A Pearl DG5833 is clearly a cost-cutting measure in order to maximise profit margin per piece. So I dislike it, and I think it's €128. It's unacceptable to be using the Pearl DG5833. It should have an NH34A, which is a superior movement. So, lastly, I'll summarise the piece. What do I think of it overall? Well, when I'm considering reviewing a watch on my channel, the watch meet two criteria. It should be both excellent quality and excellent value at the respective price points. So this is a low tier piece, €128 is the price point. It's disappointing. I'm going to declare it poor quality and poor value at €128. Lack of AR coating, the dial is too thick. We've got a shadow permanently around the date complication due to the dial being too thick. And the crown is gritty. It's difficult to unscrew and screw back down and engage the threads. So poor quality crown execution. Mineral crystal is a cost-cutting measure in the exhibition caseback. Bracelet is sloppy. Too much play in the end links and the bracelet links, so it rattles. And we've got a sterile butterfly clasp, which is unsigned. So this is just cost-cutting measure after cost-cutting measure. And the worst cost-cutting measure of all is the Lume. Using C3 Luminova is wholly unacceptable at this price point, and again this is compounded by another serious cost-cutting measure, the use of the Pearl DG5833, which is actually a Mingzhu caliber DG3804, which is unreliable. So I'm going to recommend it to you for consideration, but bear in mind the cost-cutting measures of the piece. It's poor quality and poor value. I hope you've enjoyed my review of the Pagani design PD-1792 GMT. Please feel free to post your own comments below the video. Thank you for watching.